Hey, my name's Andrew Bosco with the Candor Investment Group, and I'm excited to kind of bring you this content from the YouTube series. It helps us a ton if you like, share, and subscribe. It makes our life a little bit easier because you get to grow the channel, and we're just trying to make this for you guys at the end of the day. Help you enjoy, and let's get into it. Are you an investor and you live in Massachusetts, maybe New Hampshire, maybe Maine or Vermont, and you're investing in Massachusetts and you're thinking it's the safe choice because of just Boston or Worcester in the economic market? Is that the right choice? Now, to be honest, Massachusetts is a great state. Excellent school systems. It has the proximity to Boston as an economic hub is really powerful. It's generally a pretty safe place to live. At the end of the day, it's, in New England, we have 4 seasons, theoretically a little bit lower crime rate. Now I know there's submarkets and there's differences there across the board. But to be honest, it's interesting where I see investors choosing to invest. More often than not, they'll kind of pick Massachusetts just because they're familiar with it. Maybe it's just where they grew up. They feel it's fundamentally the right choice. Well, I'm going to kind of compare New Hampshire, Massachusetts a little bit because it's a little bit of a head-to-head competition about what's actually better for your investment strategy. And so at this point, we're going to kind of take a dive in between the two and see how they kind of, offset each other. Maybe they're like, dislike, etc. There's some pros and cons, and I think we should go over them. A lot of times people will ask me, Andrew, should I invest in New Hampshire or Massachusetts? And I always end up asking them, what matters to them? What are the things that they care about? There's cash flow, there's taxes, there's long-term outlook, there's appreciation. What are the things that matter? And of course, there's submarkets, so we need to consider that as well. A lot of people will say, well, I have X amount of dollars, I want to be I want to be this close to Boston. It's a pretty good indicator most of the time. I can figure out, hey, you honestly just can't afford Massachusetts. Or I'll say, the driving that you want, being that close, you got to be, closer to Boston. So you got to change either the property type you're trying to buy. If you're trying to live there, maybe you're trying to be an investor and you're looking for certain returns. There's kind of this game we have to play between proximity to Worcester and Boston, which are the major economic hubs, versus Manchester, Nashua being in that market in New Hampshire. And so the key though is that everyone has a different scenario. And so let's kind of dive in a little bit. I think, New Hampshire, Massachusetts both have a lot to offer depending what you're looking at. And so, depending on what matters to you, I think that's the key factor. So let's talk about the big difference between Massachusetts and New Hampshire. The obvious one is honestly purchase price. Most of the time, in more cases than not, the closer you are to Boston and or Worcester realistically, but I'll focus on Boston here, the more expensive it's going to be. Now I say in this case Worcester a little bit because Worcester's honestly mirroring Manchester, New Hampshire a lot. They're very similar, but Worcester's 4 times the size or something crazy like that. Now, the reality is Massachusetts has a higher entry price point. Whether you're trying to buy your first single family, a condo, maybe it could be a house hack, or you're buying an investment property, short-term rental, whatever it is, more often than not, the prices are going to be much higher. Now, again, I've always said the word submarket for a reason, because if you're comparing Lakeland Pisaki waterfront to buying in Lawrence, a little bit different of an animal. So understand that comes with the caveat there of all of, the submarket realm. New Hampshire is a little bit different. I think the acquisition cost of buying something is a lot lower. I think that there's a strong rent to price ratio in comparison to Massachusetts. Now, COVID has kind of changed that a little bit. New Hampshire used to be the pretty cheap option. And since COVID, pricing and inflation has gone up, rental demand has also gone up quite a bit. We've seen some kind of flatlining or plateauing over the winter, which is to be expected. But to be honest, the big differentiator between the two is really price versus rent ratio. Now, you can still look at the Section 8 HUD rents. If you don't know where those are, the link is in the chat. But that's a pretty good indicator to see what the rent demand is going on in your area. Again, I'll compare it. Worcester versus Manchester is pretty close to each other, but Boston is still commanding a really strong rental market. Now, you can look at submarkets like Lowell, Lawrence. You can look at areas like Gardner, Mass. You can look at Western Mass as well, or even Southern Mass like Taunton and New Bedford. The rental, you should look every September to see how the rents have gone up, because that'll impact kind of the purchase prices going forward a little bit, and it'll push that positive cash flow there. But it's important to kind of look at, when you're buying an investment property, that purchase price versus rent demand difference. And so Massachusetts and New Hampshire, there's kind of a clear, indicator where generally Massachusetts is more expensive. It's kind of like a rough rule of thumb. Now let's talk about the big one that everybody loves, which is appreciation. Honestly, the best appreciating market that I can think of locally is either lakefront property, or to be honest, buying luxury townhouse style properties in Boston. Massachusetts investors often rely on appreciation, in my opinion. Not always the case. I'd say that there's a lot of, specifications there. If you buy a value add property, you can have a really good chance to get some really strong cash flow. But to be honest, what I often see is that New Hampshire investors honestly get a little bit of that cash flow aspect. They get some stability because New Hampshire being that strong market people like to invest in. We're seeing that pretty often. There are some good appreciation markets in New Hampshire. I think Manchester has done historically pretty well. We've had a pretty strong growth between 3 to 6% growth year over year. You're seeing that also in Portsmouth. It's a strong appreciation market. This does have higher rents, but it's also a super high price point to enter. The reality is that when you're investing and looking at appreciation, it's important to keep in mind that you have to, appreciation will make you rich, but cash flow keeps you alive. So you kind of need both. When you're looking at Massachusetts versus New Hampshire, you got to really decide. Pick the market and the submarket you want. Ask yourself, is it hitting that appreciation submarket that you're looking for versus cash flow? Recommended markets I look at if you're looking for appreciation in New Hampshire would be like Portsmouth. I'd say anywhere, to be honest, like major hub like city, those are important. The rural towns are kind of tough to get appreciation on, primarily because of comps. They're so rare and hard and far few between. So you're gonna be fighting appraisals most of the time. You could do well if they're, next to or adjacent to a main market. So if you look at Manchester, the surrounding markets, you have Bedford is a great market, Derry, Londonderry. Those are excellent markets because they also feed into the Manchester hub. And if you're looking at appreciation, around the Portsmouth area, people look at like Newington, Dover. They look at Somersworth oftentimes, Rochester even, a little bit farther away, but those are pretty common. If you're looking at Massachusetts appreciation, the obvious answer for most people is Boston. Worcester's doing okay. I think it's still a great market, but I think Boston kind of always wins that, that classic appreciation game. So let's talk our favorite word in the world. There's two constants in life, taxes and death. The reality is that Massachusetts and New Hampshire have interesting tax perspectives to look at. So Massachusetts has, state income tax. They also have property tax. They have, at this point, I feel like 1,000 different tax structures. There's a reason it gets the nickname Taxachusetts. So you need to be mindful of that when you're buying an asset in Massachusetts. Now, if you're looking at New Hampshire, there's no income tax and there's no sales tax. There is also hefty property tax. So you need to make sure you're aware of that. Good example is like if you look at like Derry, New Hampshire, or if you look at Portsmouth, pretty high tax rate versus where if you're in more of a, I'd say commercial area, kind of like Manchester, the taxes are subdued a little bit. But realistically, the state makes quite a bit of their money from property taxes because that's their only source of income, essentially, besides the New Hampshire liquor and wine outlet. So it's important to make sure that you're looking at operating costs from a tax perspective when looking at Massachusetts and New Hampshire. In terms of landlord laws, it's important to kind of distinct the two. It's funny, if you talk to most New Hampshire investors, if you say like, hey, I got this great property in Massachusetts, they'll scoff. They'll be like, oh, I'm never going to buy there. And the reality is because they've heard horror stories about landlord laws. Landlord laws in New Hampshire, I feel like are more friendly. Evictions can take anywhere from 1 to 2 months, typically. That's pretty honest. That's a pretty common phrase. Eviction is kind of like the gold standard of like the bad scenario that's going on. Pretty much, it's considered a landlord-friendly state. It's also a quote-unquote red state, depending on the year, I feel like, and depending on which side of the judicial branch, besides the point. The reality is that New Hampshire is considered a landlord-friendly state. The regulations are a little bit less stringent than in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, on the other hand, is considered probably more of I'd say a more aggressive state for landlords in the sense that it's not as friendly, which is opportunity. We'll get to that later. But from like a landlord perspective, in my experience, I've heard evictions can take anywhere from 2 to 6 months. It's a much longer process. It's more tenant friendly. They also just put in the ballot recently to be voted in to have rent control. So there's a little bit more not friendly landlord laws that you need to be aware of when you buy in Massachusetts. It's important to kind of see like what actually makes sense. I feel like Massachusetts is kind of unpredictable at sometimes, whereas New Hampshire is a little more predictable. So those are just things to be mindful of when you're looking at landlord laws and just kind of like keep an idea of that friction. So at this point, you're probably like, Andrew, you've told me all these things between Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Where the heck am I going to buy? Well, the answer is it depends on your scenario. So before I mentioned there's kind of some opportunity when it comes to like friendliness of landlord laws. Well, to be honest, the con of New Hampshire, depending on who you are, there's institutional buyers that are buying in New Hampshire pretty often because it's an investor-friendly state. I feel like Massachusetts doesn't get that very often, so there's less competition. I've toured a property in Manchester before. It was like a 9-unit building, and there was like 45 parties. The same 9-unit building could have been in like Lowell, and I feel like a quarter of the buyers would have been there. So there's definitely some opportunity if you're in Massachusetts and you're trying to invest there, because I feel like there's competition that is less than what it is in New Hampshire, given the desirability. That comes with risk. So that's just something to be mindful of. Everybody that buys, and for whatever reason, has their own reason for it. In other words, you might be looking for something where you're like, I have a ton of capital. I don't care about cash flow because I make enough money, but I want appreciation. I'm going to be like, you should definitely buy, if you really like New Hampshire, you should buy either like a lake house or you should buy something in Portsmouth, like a big multifamily. Go that route. Maybe, you might even look at new construction, or you're going to go to Massachusetts and go to Boston and get a high-rise condo, or like I got a beautiful home right next to Boston. We're going to have great appreciation, but pretty much minimal to no cash flow. It depends on your scenario. Everybody's different. Now, if you're a house hacker, I'm going to tell you something totally different, which is it only matters where you want to live. If you're a house hacker, the only thing that truly does matter is, do you like the place that you live? And then it's just, are you living there for less than if you were renting? Now, if you're an investor, obviously you're looking at appreciation versus cash flow. You got to decide what makes sense to you. I would say at the end of the day, both states are great. it comes down to what you want. So what I just went through is an exact conversation style that we have with the Candor Investment Group with all of our clients. We always kind of ask clients, like, what are your needs? Where are you trying to buy? And this is a pretty much common conversation that we have between Massachusetts and New Hampshire. People are already looking in Massachusetts. Maybe they're living there now and they're looking to kind of rebalance their life and go to New Hampshire. Maybe they're like, nope, I like to stay close to the proximity of where I'm at in Massachusetts. Can you kind of advise me on like, what would you recommend? What's some certain price points I should look for? Other people, to be honest, are looking how to deploy capital. Maybe you're trying to go from renting to buying. Maybe you currently own a single family and you want to buy an asset. Maybe you're renting and you want to like build a portfolio. You could have any reason for it, but this is a really common conversation that we have on a continual basis. To be honest, the goal of the conversation is to give you clarity. And so I've kind of gone back and forth between New Hampshire and Massachusetts. There's a lot of if and thens. You have to decide what's the checkbox that matters to you the most. So if you're deciding between New Hampshire and Massachusetts, maybe you own something, maybe you're considering something, maybe you're renting, trying to move out, you might have your own situation. You don't need a pitch. You honestly need clear numbers and you need clarity. I've helped a lot of people like this. Our agents have helped a lot of people like this. Everybody at the Candor Investment Group would love to have a conversation with you. My information's below. You can go in the description and find me. Give me a call, text me. I'm happy to have a conversation anytime. Set up a meeting with me. We can go over something like 15, 20 minutes. I probably in 15 or 20 minutes could save you a lot of hassle for what you're trying to decide to do from an investment standpoint. No pressure, just a clear conversation and to really fit your goals, because our goal is to help 1 million people reach financial independence. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to see certain content, definitely comment below so I can kind of keep making these videos and know what you guys need. Thank you so much.